All
Just give
right.
me this
Record.
whole
We are
time.
recording. So, last Thursday, this is like so stupid. So like my blood pressure is like really bad. It's pretty high, and so the doctor told me no more caffeine, like none. So I'm like, well, she told me to like titrate myself off, like half, and then well, I'm a dumbass. I'm like, oh, right. So Thursday, I was like, no caffeine, nothing. And man, I had some severe withdrawals. by the by the time I got to 5 o'clock at the end of work, I felt horrible. I mean, I had a headache. I was weak. I was like, there's no fucking way I can lecture for the next 3.5 hours because I teach this class and I on Thursdays I teach like the 2 hour and 45 minute section of general psych. I was like, there's no way I could do that. So I said, I'm sorry, guys. We're gonna. But here's the good news, right? The good news is that we were gonna cover chapter two, which is research methods, and like nobody likes chapter two. It is just it's like it's a horror. I like it. I like that shit. But like no normal people like chapter two. So it's just I mean, you're not missing a lot by not covering it. So we're not going to do chapter two, right? So I'm going to move on to chapter three. So you can forget about chapter two, unless you want to read it for your own edification. But we're not you're not going to be tested on chapter two. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So the exam will not have any questions from chapter two. Uh, so it'll be chapters one and three, and let's see. Let me pull up the syllabus here real quick. Yeah, and chapter four. So one, three, and four. So and we do the exam's coming up in 10 days on the 11th. That's when it's opened, and it is due uh, on the 14th. So
Woohoo.
that's coming up. So if you haven't turned on your camera, please do so. If I would greatly prefer that you turn on your cameras. If you don't want to, that's okay. But it's easier to teach classes like this when cameras are on. Um, but the Stetler. Let's see. So yeah, you guys look great as always. It's good to see you again. Does anybody have any questions so far about this ordeal that we've been going through? Anybody have any questions or comments or?
Oh, well, I mean, my only question was, are you feeling better? But I mean, if it was something like a caffeine withdrawal, then I figured you're probably feeling peachy by now because that thing only lasts
I'm
about.
feeling a hell of a lot better than I did on Thursday. I tell you that. I was okay by Friday. Like so, Friday morning I had 1 cup of coffee. That was it. Normally I have like three, and then I drink Diet Coke like all day long. I have a tragic addiction to Diet Coke. Um, but for those of you who may not know, so caffeine is a stimulant. We're going to be talking about that later when we talk about different drugs. Caffeine is classified as a stimulant drug. So a stimulant drug is a drug that actually increases the activity of most of the neurons of your brain. There are actually sites on proteins inside of the neurons of your brain that caffeine binds to, and it alters the functions of those sites so that the uh, the neuron which we're going to talk about in these lectures actually starts burning more energy and starts acting, operating much more quickly and burning more energy. And that's the way that caffeine sort of wakes you up. So it goes in, floods into your brain, hypercharges all of your cells, and that's the little boost that you get from caffeine. It's a relatively mild stimulant. It's not like nicotine is a very potent stimulant, like the stuff in cigarettes, which I smoked for 20 years, and honestly, I miss it a lot. I wish I could still smoke, but I guess what are you gonna do? Um,
Smoke 6 packs a day.
Yeah, yeah. I used to do like 1 or 2 packs a day, so depending, right? If when you're out at a bar, it's like 5 packs a day, but I used to do maybe 1 or 2 a day. But nicotine is actually a very potent stimulant. And then the stimulants that are even higher in potency are stuff like cocaine and amphetamines. Meth. Crystal meth is basically like El Cheapo amphetamine. Um, so those are the types of drugs that we're talking about. So that I was withdrawing from. So your junkie professor was withdrawing from never say meth,
Coffee.
right? Or meth, never meth, or those pictures they have of the before and after the meth people. Never say meth, never say caffeine, right? Anyway, okay, so let's go ahead and get started with chapter 3, and it's biopsychology. Probably my favorite topic. This is actually the area of psychology that I am was trained in originally as a neuroscientist. Actually, back in the day, we were called biopsychologists or physiological psychologists, but nowadays it's more. Most of us refer to ourselves as neuroscientists or behavioral neuroscientists. Um, but it's usually the starting point. In a course like this, when we're talking about behavior, it's usually the starting point because you know as far as we know, we know quite a lot. The brain, this big chunk of hamburger meat that you have inside your skull, seems to be pretty involved in mediating our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. Right? I mean, if you don't have a brain, you've got problems, right? But the nice thing is you don't know you have problems because you don't know shit, right? If you don't have a brain. Um, so the brain is really responsible for uh, is the organ that's responsible for a lot of for integrating and regulating and controlling all of our behaviors and thoughts and feelings and actions. Now there's a big philosophical debate as to how much the brain actually does, right? What does it do relative to everybody else, uh, but or to everything else out in the outside world. But suffice it to say that we know that the brain is important, and the study of the brain is usually where we start, right? Because that's kind of like the machine. In the mechanistic view of science, the brain is the machine where behavior begins, right? And then starting at the very beginning, we start with genetics, right? We start with genetics, and your book, for some odd reason, I don't know why, but your book has the first example that it gives in terms of talking about genetics is talking about sickle cell anemia. And I think the point of the of that introduction is really to tell you about how complicated genetics can be. The study of genetics and consequently the study of evolution, which leads, which is connected to genetics. The study of genetics is an extremely complex topic. The example that's given in your book on page 74 of your book is in fact talking about sickle cell anemia. Now, sickle cell anemia, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this disease. If we had, I don't see any African American folks here. A lot of Hispanics, a couple of white folks, but no no black folks. Anyway, if you happen to be black, then you might have heard of sickle cell anemia because it tends to be endemic in black populations. That's because it was a condition that evolved in Africa. And it's really odd because what happens is due to a genetic defect, your let me see if I can pull up a picture here real quick. I love pictures of whoops, sickle. There it is. And let me find a little picture here. Let's see images, and oh, look at that! Look at all those pictures. So nice to be a teacher in the age of Google. So let's see. Here we go. So there's one right there. Pull that guy out. Where'd it go? Oh, there. No, where's that nice picture? There it is. All right. So let me share my screen here. Boink. basic desktop and share. All right, so here's where'd that go? There you go. Oh, now I have to be informed. Okay, screw that. Okay, so if you can see this picture right here, uh, these little round donut shaped things, they're flat. They're kind of like indented here in the middle, and then like shaped like donuts. Those are blood cells, and we have billions of blood cells that are carrying oxygen and nutrients to the cell, all the cells of our body. And what happens in sickle cell anemia is all of a sudden these cells start growing, bending into like the shape of a sickle. And you would think, oh well, big fucking deal, right? They still work, right? I mean, they still carry oxygen, which they do, but the problem is when they're shaped like that, they can't fit into the microcapillaries that nourish flesh. So you end up with this condition called sickle cell anemia, where you're extremely weak and sick and can die from not having enough oxygen and nourishment going to the flesh of your body, to all of the parts of your body, because of the shape of these cells. Now, this happened through the process of evolution. You might be wondering why the hell, WTF evolution? Why did you do this? Well, it turns out that this is a good protection against malaria, believe it or not. Malaria is an extremely complex disease. I don't know if you guys have heard or know about malaria, right? But basically, malaria is a disease that you get from a mosquito bite. So the mosquito bites you, and as it's sucking your blood, there's these little microorganisms that are going into your blood, and they go in and they find a place to settle in, and then they produce eggs, and those eggs produce worms, and then those worms go live in red blood cells, and then the red blood cells go into the circulatory system, and then when the next mosquito comes along, it sucks the fresh new worms out of that are inside the blood cells, and then it carries on into the next victim. So the malaria parasite, which is this bacterium, has a very strange life cycle of being a bacterium and then a spore, and then then it lives inside these cells. So what happens is, by having sickle cell anemia, what you're basically doing is you're stopping the process of spreading malaria, right? You're stopping the process of spreading malaria. So once these sickle cells, since they can't go everywhere in the body, it reduces the amount of malaria bacteria that's spread in your body, so you get less sick from malaria, and you don't pass malaria on to the next person, which is kind of cool, right? So it's a very odd adaptation. It's called an adaptation, right? And that's really the key take home lesson here is that um, all critters, pretty much all critters, including us, we're critters, right, that are products of evolution. All critters are the result of evolution, and that evolution happened by adaptation. Now, the reason we know this about adaptation, in other words, our bodies and our behaviors adapting to the environment that we're in, the reason we know this is because, of course, of Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin published a book called The Origin of Species, Origin of Species, which, if you haven't read it, honestly, I suggest you do get it and read it. It's one of those great works of Western civilization that everybody should be aware of. Go ahead and grab, you can get it for free online. It's in the Gutenberg Project Gutenberg site. It's available. You don't have to pay any money to read this book. But the main thing that Darwin did in his work was that he actually let me look. Whoops. Oh, come on, Ray. There he is. I put in Darwin, and I got the little guy from The Amazing World of Gumball. Let's see. Images. Okay, so there's Charles Darwin. Let me, oops, I'm going to share my screen again real quick. All right, so here's a picture of Charles Darwin. I don't know, you've probably seen this picture before, right? Born in 1809, died in 1882. But of course, before he passed away, he published his book. He waited like 25 years before he published this book because he wanted to make absolutely sure it was right. And he was really kind of afraid of the effect that it would have. And sure enough, it is the Charles Darwin's book is one of the greatest works of science. I mean, it's right up there with Newton's Principia and Einstein's special and general theories of relativity. It's you can't overestimate how big Charles Darwin is and his work. But basically, here's the thing: we knew for a long time, in fact, that evolution occurs, right? Because if you go out in nature, if you spend any time in nature, um, with looking at plants and animals and studying how plants and animals live and how the whole ecosystem sort of fits together. If you spend any time doing that, it's immediately obvious that there's this big machine of there's something working behind the scenes that's making sure everything works together, making sure animals are adapted to their environments, and it's immediately obvious. So it's been known for a long time, right? And of course, if you're, if you happen to be of the religious bent, you're going to say, well, it's just God's preordained, uh, organization of the universe. Okay, it's like, all right, that's cool, right? But what's the mechanism, right? What's the mechanism of how it works? And that's what we had trouble figuring out. Nobody could really figure out how evolution worked, right? Nobody until Charles Darwin came along. And his big contribution wasn't the idea of evolution. Like I said, that's been around since the ancient Greeks. His big contribution was the mechanism of evolution, how it actually works. And his big concept that he introduced to the world was natural selection. Natural selection. And essentially, what that means is that critters are selected based on how well they can survive in a particular environment. Okay. Have you ever seen like, uh, breeds of dogs, right? You see all these dog breeds that are out there. There's pugs and poodles and labs and Irish setters and Great
Golden
Dane.
retrievers.
Say again? Golden, yeah,
Golden retrievers.
Goldens, right? Goldens are like the ultimate dog, right? They're the most awesome dog ever, right? Golden retrievers. I mean, there's lots of breeds out there, and how did they make those breeds? Well, the way they made those breeds is, some a bitch, which is the term for a female dog. It's a bitch, right? So some bitch gives birth to some puppies, right? And there's a puppy that has a particular like characteristic that people like maybe a little flat nose or long fur or whatever. And people take that puppy and breed it with another puppy that might have some of the same characteristics, and they make more puppies that have a slightly, that have a slightly greater chance of having those characteristics. And they selectively breed these puppies until they end up with the kind of puppy that they want. That's artificial selection. That's where humans are going in, and we've done that with plants and cattle and horses and cats and rats and chickens, and that's where we get all our variety of domestic animals that we have nowadays.
Mule.
But in natural selection, what happens is an organism has some sort of like adaptation, and it better work in that environment that organism is in, or else that organism is not going to succeed. It's going to die and not reproduce. For example, if you have an organism that requires a lot of water, that has to drink a lot of water, that organism probably wouldn't survive. See my background here? This background that I have behind me is my home territory, kind of located in Zavala County, Texas, South
Yeah, I
Texas.
think I camped out there once.
Yeah, it's hot. It's hot as fuck, and there's thorns and everything, and every living thing is trying to kill you, right, or hurt you. But it's hot out there, and there's not a lot of water that's on the surface. So if you happen to be an organism that needs a lot of water to drink, how successful are you going to be living in this environment? Not very, right? You're not going to live that long. So as a result, as the environment changes, organisms have to change to meet the requirements of the environment. So what happens is the organisms that have the right adaptations through mutations in their genetic code will survive and pass on those mutations, those genes onto the next generation. And if you combine that with the hundreds of millions and millions of years of evolution, you end up with this process by which species can evolve and change. And that is, that was Darwin's big contribution to the world, was this notion of how species can evolve and change through natural selection. And the take-home message for you guys is that all of our traits that we have, our eyes, our ears, our body shapes, our noses, our mouths, everything, is the result of is probably the result of natural selection. And that also includes our behaviors. A lot of our behaviors have fundamental components that are due to natural selection. Now, I'm not making one thing you need to understand is I'm not claiming that everything that we are, that we think and do is due to natural selection. That's ridiculous because humans, we're not like other animals, right? With other animals, it's like pretty much everything they do is due to natural selection. But humans also have culture. We also have culture and language. Those evolve too, in their own way, right? So a lot of our behaviors are also culturally determined, right? Uh, as well as a little bit mediated through evolution and natural selection. Um, here's a question for you. Here's a question for you. Why do we fuck? What's the purpose of doing the nasty? Anybody? What's
Just standard reproduction.
Yeah, okay, so
Maybe like
reproduction, right? That's the reason the system evolved, right? Was for reproduction. Of course, we humans get a lot of pleasure out of it for certain reasons, and of course we do fucky fucky, just to do fucky fucky, right? Not to make babies, right? But think about this: why? Why do we have to have two people get together and mix their genes together to make a baby? Like women, you could just do like what's called parthenogenic reproduction, right? Where you just like make an entire new baby out of your own genes, right? It's not as fun, but it's less messy, right? but why do we have this whole process where you know I you know we have to get our sperm cells and egg cells in close contact. The sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell, and from that point on, that becomes a human being, and it grows into a baby and a person. Why do we have that weird setup, right? The reason sexual reproduction evolved, the reason we have sexual reproduction is because of the advantages it gives us in terms of genetic variability, the genetic variation, I should say, the term that's in the middle of page 76 of your textbook, genetic variation. What is genetic variation? Well, the smartass answer, of course, is that it's variation in genetics. Right? This is the answer my smartass son would give me, right? What's genetic variation? Oh, there's a variation in genetics, which is actually the correct answer, right? So, genetic variation is basically a nice variation of genes for each trait in a population. Okay. So the genes that you have in each of your cells are made up of what are called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, right? DNA. Let me pull up a picture here of DNA. I guess that's a nice little picture. Oh, it's the Wikipedia article. How about that? All right, so let me share that mofo. There we go. Share and bada bing. So here's a picture of DNA, and you guys have probably seen this before. It's the double helix, right? It's two helixes that are twisted around each other, and there's these little ladder steps in between each helix, and each one of the molecules that you see inside of that make up this ladder is a certain what's called an amino acid. It's either T, A, C, or G, right? Taurine, adenine, cytosine, or guanine, right? It's one of those four. And those are mixed into a code sequence, kind of like Morse code, like so you have this long code, and basically DNA encodes all of the information to build all the proteins in your body. And if you have all the information to build all your proteins, you have all the information to build an entire body, because proteins are the machines that build organisms, right? On today's Earth, it's protein. So the DNA is actually coding um, all of the information that it takes to build you. Okay, we each have a copy of all our DNA in every cell of our body. Um, you've I guess have you guys heard of like the DNA analysis that crime scene investigators do? You ever heard of that before? And basically what that is they look for some product of your body like spit or sweat or blood or semen or something like that. And if they find a sample of your DNA, like in some little droplet that you left, they can take that, take it to a lab, extract out your DNA, and then identify you by matching it with your own sample, because all of our DNA is unique. um, there's only a very very small chance that somebody who is not my twin brother, I don't have a twin brother, but if I did, right, we would have the same DNA, an identical twin brother. But there's only a minuscule probability that two randomly selected people have the same DNA. So that's how the cops are able to match DNA profiles, is by just taking DNA, breaking down these sequences of T's, A's, C's, and G's, and writing that code down, and then seeing if that code matches up with somebody else. Um, DNA is the encoding. The encoding that's inside of DNA is known as your genotype, GENO type, genotype. And that's what they're matching when they do the DNA analysis. So your genotype is what codes all of your qualities that you have in you. So I'm a standard issue South Texas Mexican, right? Brown eyes, brown hair, brown skin, brown everything, right? I'm just brown, right? Everything place I come from is all brown. Everything's brown, right? So my genes are encoding for brown skin, brown eyes. If you have blue eyes or green eyes, you're going to have different genes for that. If you have red hair or blonde hair, you're going to have different genes for that. If you have light fair skin, you're going to have different genes for that. If you're from African countries where the sun is very intense, you'll have genes that encode for more blackness in your skin to protect you from the ultraviolet radiation. The genotype is what codes for all those traits. Now, the way those traits are expressed, whether it's brown eyes, blue eyes, dark skin, light skin, whatever it is, the way they're expressed is called your phenotype, PHENO, phenotype. So you got your genotype, which is the code that you see here, millions, and it's long strands of code, right? And then that is all used to build out your phenotype, whatever it is whatever qualities you have. Okay. Um, each trait, or I should say, each uh, allele, each area of DNA that codes for a certain protein is called an allele, Alle, allele. And what alleles are matched up in pairs. Okay. Now, when you have sex, okay, who hasn't had sex? Raise your hand. Just kidding. Just kidding. Yeah. I was just kidding.
I'm very alone.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Oh my god. Blaine's first got shot his hand up. That's me. Anyway, so okay, so when you have sex, right? One of the things that you're doing is you're transferring your genetic information. If you're the man, right? If you're the dude, right? And we're talking about heterosexual sex here, right? I know there's all kinds of sex out there. So, so if you, let's say a heterosexual couple, a man and a woman are getting it on, right? And so what happens is that when the man ejaculates, he, of course, we've all seen this in porn movies, right? That wonderful moment, but it has to happen inside of a woman's private parts. But what happens, what's in the ejaculate, of course, are millions of swimming sperm cells, right? The little swimmers, right? They're all, and what the swimmers are looking for, what the sperm cells are looking for, is the egg that is contained in the inside in the ovaries of a fertile female. Now, each sperm cell and each egg does not have the number of chromosomes that we have in our other cells. Okay, humans have a grand total in each of our cells of 46 chromosomes. 46 chromosomes. Okay, now you you get half of those chromosomes from mom and the other half of those chromosomes from dad. Okay, so that means in the sperm cell there's 23 chromosomes, and in the egg cell there's 23 chromosomes. And so what happens is the little sperm cells make their way up into, up the little fallopian tube and into into, and they find an egg, and they all fight to get in, and eventually one of them gets in, right? And what happens is that sperm cell makes its way to the nucleus of the egg, and it discharges its DNA into the with the DNA of the egg, and they form a complete set of chromosomes to build a complete human being. Okay, so that is the way in which you get the qualities that you have from your mom and your dad. Most of you probably look somewhat like your biological parents, right? Most of you do. I know when people see me and my son together, they're like, "Oh, it's pretty obvious that you're his dad," because it's like we look, from around here, our eyes and our hair, we look really alike, right? Um, so, and the reason for that is because some of the genetic information that went into producing my son, came from that moment of conception, right? Now, the pairing of the cell, the DNA from the egg and the sperm, right? So gene, for each gene, you're getting one allele for mom and one allele for dad. So let's say, for example, you have the gene, we're talking about the gene for eye color. Okay, the gene for eye color. Okay, that's the typical example that's given. You're going to get an eye color gene from mom and an eye color gene from dad. Now, those two genes are going to work together to determine what your eye color is. Okay, and this is the way all genes work. Okay, now the way they work together is this: every gene has what's called a dominant allele and a what do they call it here in the book? Recessive allele. A dominant allele and a recessive allele. Okay, so any given gene is going to have a typical dominant allele. So in humans, what's the most common eye color in humans? What's the most common eye color all 7 billion people? What is the most common eye color?
Blue.
Nope.
Well, I tried.
Is it brown?
Yeah, brown. Yeah, brown eyes. Yeah, brown
Brown.
eyes. Yeah, brown eyes. That is the most so brown is the dominant allele in humans for the gene for eye color. Okay? So if mom gives you a dominant brown allele, like my mother gave me, because a bunch of Mexicans, right? And dad gives you a dominant brown allele for eye color, what color are your eyes going to be? So you get a dominant brown allele from mom and a dominant brown allele from dad. What color are your eyes going to be?
Brown.
Brown, yeah, brown. You're going to be brown. Right? You're standard issue Mexican, right? Brown. Right? Okay, let's say, right? Let's say that you get a dominant brown allele from dad, right? But from mom, you get a recessive blue-eyed allele. So you have a brown allele dominant, recessive blue-eyed allele. Okay. What color are your eyes going to be?
Brown.
Brown. Yeah, they're going to be brown because the dominant allele wins. However, when you go and make babies, you're going to be so you have brown eyes, right? But you've got in your genes, you've got that recessive allele, that blue-eyed allele. So what's going to happen is when you make a baby, half of your eggs or sperm, whatever it is, are going to have the recessive gene for the blue eye, and the other half of your eggs or sperm are going to have the dominant gene for the brown eyes. And that's how sometimes you get these situations where people, the wife has brown eyes, and the husband has brown eyes, but they give birth to a baby with blue eyes, right? And of course, the husband's like, "What the fuck, woman? Are you cheating on me?" Right? And it's like, no, no, no. It's just that my mom was like, blue-eyed, right? Mom was blue-eyed, so I got a recessive blue-eyed gene from her, right? So I just passed it on to to her grandchild, right, to her baby, right? What happens if you get a recessive blue-eyed allele from mom and a recessive blue-eyed allele from dada? What do you get? What color are your eyes? Rhymes with Lou.
Blue.
Blue, yes, blue. Yeah, yeah, your eyes are blue. If you get the recessive blue-eyed allele from mom and your eyes are blue. Okay, and then when you have babies, you're gonna be passing on totally blue-eyed thing. So you can see now if you start talking about mixing and matching different alleles and dominant alleles and recessive alleles, you can see where all the genetic variation comes from, right? We have alleles for hair color. We have alleles for how curly your hair is, how much fat you have, the enamel on your teeth, uh, how big your stomach is, just alleles for coding, multiple alleles for coding all kinds of things. Most traits involve multiple alleles, right? Like for example, how tall you are. How tall you are. That's genetic to a large extent. It's also due to your environment, obviously, because you have to eat well. But how tall you are is determined by multiple alleles all working together, right? Lots of them, right? But if you get the right set of alleles from mom and the right set of alleles from dad, and the right ones are dominant, you'll be tall or short, depending on however the. But here's the take home lesson. Here's the take home lesson. That genetic variability is important. That genetic variability is important. It's important to have a lot of genetic variability because it ensures that the species is healthy and it will survive any changes in the environment. Okay? Think about this, right? What if we had a population of humans that had no genes for any brown or black skin? They were just pale white, okay? And they had no genes in their population. Well, what's going to happen to them when global warming is getting worse and worse and worse and worse, right? It's going to get hotter and hotter and hotter due to global warming. It already is, right? And we're going to have more ultraviolet radiation bombing down on us, right? So what do you think is going to happen to those people? What's going to happen to those people that have like no, that they're just pale, pasty white, pasty white people, right? What's going to happen to them in that environment? Are they going to do well?
No, they're gonna bake.
Yeah, they're going to bake and they're probably going to die, right? They're probably going to die because, in fact, they'll probably die of cancer and all kinds of other diseases as a result of being exposed to so much ultraviolet radiation. Now, if you have a population of people that has a wide variation of skin colors, all the way from the pasty white folks to the really, really dark people, like when you meet those people from Africa and they're like really, really dark, right? You got that whole variation. Then a part of your population is more likely to survive if something like that happened, right? So genetic variation is good, right? That's why from the days of Adolf Hitler, and you see all these white supremacists who are like, racial purity, racial purity, right? We want to have a pure race. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, guys, go for it. You guys go and make a pure inbred race, and I can already tell you what's going to happen, but it couldn't happen to a nicer bunch of people. All you motherfuckers are going to die, right? Because eventually you're going to die out because you're lacking a genetic diversity. Um, so genetic diversity is responsible for all of the different, shapes and sizes and types of people that you see. You ever look at different cats, right? Coat colors, the colors of cats, their fur. We've mapped out all the genes that contribute to the fur color of cats, right? So some cats have little white mittens, and some cats are like tuxedo cats. They have a little tuxedo. Some cats have little mustache. You ever seen the cats with the mustache? I think that's adorable. Right? All of those, those genes have all been mapped out. So we can pull the genes out of a fertilized egg of a cat, map them out. We can tell you what kind of coat that cat is going to have when he grows up, which is kind of cool, right? Now, the big debate, one of the big debate in psychology, really in all of science, but in psychology, is this debate of the environment versus genetics. Okay, because there's two big things that influence and that make you what you are. There's the environment that you're raised in and the genetics that you have on board that you were given by your parents. Okay, which one matters most? The environment that you live in and are raised in, or the genes that you have in your body? Which one matters most, do you think?
Is this a rhetorical question or?
I mean, it's a straight up question.
Mm, well, I mean, I would kind of say the environment because like the genes you have, you're kind of stuck with, but like the environment could kind of change them over time. So I mean, I kind of feel like the environment could kind of make a bigger impact. I guess is the best thought process I have. I'm
Sometimes,
sorry if
yeah.
that's real.
Well, sometimes. The right answer is both matter, right? Both matter. Both matter a lot. It's not one or the other. It's nature versus nurture, right? We say nature versus nurture. Nature being the genes that you have, and nurturing being the environment that you're raised in, right? So here's an example, right? Let's say you're born with the genetic makeup. You've got the genes on board. You got some genes from mom and dad. Let's say you're born with the genes that make you as smart as Albert Einstein. Okay, you guys know who Albert Einstein is, right? The famous physicist, right? Let's say you got those genes on board. All right. Now, when Einstein died, they actually took his brain out of his head and studied it, and he did have some differences in his brain relative to normal people, right? He did. He had some interesting differences in his brain. So let's say you got those genes and you're like, oh, holy fuck, now I'm smart. Now I'm as smart as Albert Einstein. Okay, right? But let's say you were raised in a horribly uh, deprived, abusive environment, right? Let's say your parents just locked you in a closet and didn't interact with you. They beat you. They sexually abused you. And you spent the first 13 or 14 years of your life like that before the cops finally came and arrested your parents, right? Would you be as smart as Einstein if you were raised in that environment? No, probably not, right? I mean, Einstein had the advantage of having, a loving, supportive family, a very educated family, and the right genetic combination, right? Let's say you're born with, and let's take the other example. Let's say you're born with just normal, regular genes, right? Just regular old genes, right? And you're okay, right? But you're raised in wealth, right? So your parents love you, they support you, they're perfect parents. They give you all the food and comfort you need. They expose you to books and different knowledge. They travel, they take you on trips all around the world all the time, so you learn all these different languages. um, do you think you could be a little bit smarter than your genes said you were? Yeah, probably. Yeah. So the interaction between the genes that you have in your body and the environment that you grow up in is very complicated. It's a very complicated interaction, and they both work together, as explained in your book, on page, I guess, 79 and 80. Both the genes and environment work together to sort of ultimately produce the the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you behave. Okay, so it's an extremely complicated problem that we still haven't figured out yet. I mean, there's still a lot of research that's being done to understand the role of genes and the role of environment, especially with things like, for example, sexual orientation, gender identity, right? How much of that is determined by culture, how much of that is determined by genetics. That's apparently a question of great debate, right? So I'll stop there and ask if anybody has any questions or comments about anything. Kathleen's just pulling her hair. She's just like, you look bored, Kathleen. I'm sorry.
It was a long day at work.
Uh, where do you work?
The TJ Maxx distribution center.
Oh my God. So you're on your feet like all day long. Oh,
Mhm.
wow. Where is that located, in San Marcos or?
No, it's on 281.
Oh,
Like
wow.
not even 10 minutes away from A&M.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Does it pay well?
Yeah, it starts out good.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
never know, right, man? I'm
Yeah.
I'm glad that you're at least making good money.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for putting up with this in spite of your tired. I feel the same way. I'm dead fucking tired. I would rather be doing anything right now than this, but it's like, I gotta teach, right? So you guys paid for this shit, so. Anybody have any questions or comments? Elia, you're just kind of like chilling there in bed. You look like you're listening to records or something, or listening to music.
I'm
She's all,
tired.
yeah,
Class.
everybody's tired. Yeah, all you guys all probably work, right? Right? You guys probably all have like me, right? Day jobs. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's tough. It's tough to work a day job and then come and have to spend time using your brain still. But trust me, it's a lot easier to do this when you're young than when you're old. Trust me. So you're doing the right thing. But I have a lot of respect and admiration for those of you that work, a full-time job, and some of you even have kids, which is like amazing, and still are working to get your degree. That to me is a hell of an achievement. Uh, one of the toughest people I know, the toughest people is my sister. I have a sister named her name is Nora. She lives in Austin, and she got pregnant at a very young age. I think she was 18 when she got pregnant with her son. The issue is that her son is like severely autistic, so she's had, now he's like in his 30s now, right? And but anyway, she had this autistic son, right? And and as a single mother, and managed to still work. She graduated from UT Austin with honors, and now and she's got a great job right now, working at a hospital, and she's just tough as hell. I mean, my sister is like really tough, but anyway, that's like, she's like, one of my hero, right? Because she's had a really tough life, but yeah, it's one of those things that we all, crosses we must bear. um so now that we've talked a little bit about evolution, evolutionary biology, really, you know, now we can. So now you have a basic understanding of where we came from and how this, how this hamburger meat in our heads evolved, right? One of the big questions, actually, one of the things I should mention is one of the big questions we have in evolution, in human evolution, is, why did our brains evolve to be so big and massive? What happened? uh, it only happened less than a million years ago. We were like, we came from a branch of little hominids, little monkey type, little monkey type things, right? And all the little monkey type things that we have found so far, the fossils, they had like small little pinheads, right? But then all of a sudden, just boom, we had this explosion in our brains. And over the course of about a quarter million years, our brains just expanded like crazy. And there's a lot of debate going on as to why that happened. What was the event that precipitated that? So it's an interesting problem, right? It's an interesting thing that we're still trying to figure out. So let's talk now about the actual machinery. Okay, the actual brain. So we're going to talk about our nervous system. And when we talk about our nervous system, we always talk about the cells that make up our different our nervous system. And the main cell that makes up our let me find a nice picture here of our typical cell. Oh, here we go. This is not bad. Once again, Wikipedia to the rescue. Okay. uh, this picture, which let me share with you real quick. Boing, 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 and bam. Can you guys all see that? See that, the spidery looking thing? Okay, this is a picture of what we usually refer to as a typical neuron. Okay. Your brain, your whole nervous system, but your brain in particular, your brain is made up partially of millions, billions, actually, billions of cells that are all talking to each other, that are communicating with each other. These cells form circuits, and these circuits group together into nuclei, and these nuclei come together to form structures in your brain, and then those structures all come together to form your brain. But the fundamental building block of the nervous system is the neuron, Neuron. And the neuron is the cell that actually communicates with the rest, with other neurons. And they form these circuits that underlie all of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. Okay. And this is a picture of a typical neuron. It's not really a typical neuron. Neurons come in all shapes and sizes. They all look different. This is actually what's called a motor neuron. A motor neuron, MOT, like a motor in a car. And a motor neuron is the neuron that actually runs from your back, from your spinal cord, out to your muscles. Okay, so it's the one that carries the signal for you to be able to move your fingers and your toes and your legs and your arms. Okay, that's what this motor neuron is. Now you'll notice it's made up of first here in the middle we have the main cell body, the cell body, right? And this contains all of the equipment that a typical cell needs to live. So it has the nucleus and the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria. Those are all the different parts of a cell, right? Some of you, did you in school, did you ever make like a cell out of candy or you ever make one of those in school? With all the different part. My kids had to do that once. Now, radiating out from the cell are these little guys right here. Okay, they look like branches on a tree, right? And you can you can think of them exactly as branches sort of sitting there in three-dimensional space, just like the branches of a tree. And these branches, they're called dendrites. Here's the word right here, dendrite, Dendrite. Dendrites are like an antenna. Dendrites pick up signals from other neurons. So when other neurons want to talk to this neuron, they send a signal touching one of these dendrites. Okay? So a cell like this that has all these dendrites might have connections to hundreds of other cells that are all connecting here and talking to all these dendrites. Okay? And I'll talk a little bit later about what that signal is, right? But just keep it in your head right now that what's going on is that there's another cell that comes up, from like say here, if you can see my mouse moving, and then it connects right there. And whenever it wants to send a signal to this neuron, it sends a signal out and that's how they communicate. Okay. So you have the dendrites, the cell body, and then you have this little kind of like triangle shaped area right here on the cell body. And this is called the axon hillock. The axon hillock. Hillock is basically like a bump. So this is the axon hillock. Okay. And the axon hillock is a very important place. A lot of complicated shit happens at the axon hillock. Okay. Now, let me, let's see. See how your book lays this out. Okay. So here's what happens, right? The axon hillock is responsible for gathering all of the signals that come on the dendrites. So those signals are little electrical potentials. So believe it or not, our brains use electrochemical energy to communicate. And as a matter of fact, if you put very sensitive sensors on your skull, like wear a hat with these very sensitive sensors on it, you can actually detect the electrical activity of your brain. It's called an electroencephalograph, an EEG, and you can actually detect it. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the next chapter when we talk about sleep. But all these signals that are hitting this neuron from the dendrites, all these little electrical signals make their way to the axon hillock. So the axon hillock is sitting there, and what it's doing is it's adding up all the signals. So it adds up all the signals, and if it adds up all those signals, and if that entire sum adds up to a certain threshold value, then the axon hillock does something amazing. Okay. So it's sitting there counting the signals, right? And sometimes they go down and sometimes they go up, right? But if those signals that the axon hillock is getting from the dendrites hit some threshold, if it crosses the threshold, then what this axon hillock does is it sends a massive electrical pulse down this cable. Okay. It sends one, well, several actually, pulses, large electrical pulses down this cable. Okay. This cable is properly referred to as an axon. It's an axon. And axons bundle together to form big, fat, thick cables, which we call nerves. In the body, we call them nerves. In the brain, they're called pathways, right? But this guy right here, the Axon Hillock, is counting, assessing all of the signals that are coming in on the dendrites, and if it reaches some value, some threshold value, it says, okay, bang. It sends a bunch of big electrical pulses down this axon. Those electrical pulses make their way over to these guys right here, which are called synaptic terminals. Synaptic terminals, okay? At the very tips of the synaptic terminals are connections, kind of, I'll explain why, but connections to another neuron. So the signal, this big electrical pulse comes down here, makes its way to these synaptic terminals. Then the synaptic terminals send their own signal out to this neuron. So it gets stimulated. It has an axon hillock that it's adding up its signals, and then it goes and it sends a signal on down. And in that way, you get this propagation of signals from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron. Okay, does that make sense? For you your tired brains, does that make sense? Okay, so to review, right? To review, signals come in from other neurons on the dendrites. All those signals get added up here at the axon hillock. If and only if those signals add up to some threshold value, the axon hillock fires a bunch of massive pulses down this cable, the axon. Those pulses make their way to the very ends of these synaptic terminals. The synaptic terminals then send their own signal as a result of this big axon signal. They send their own signal across to the next neuron in the chain. Okay, easy peasy, right? Not too complicated. I just gave you the results of about 150 years of scientific research. It took us that long to figure this shit out, right? A couple of details here. The Axon Cable is actually this, and this picture doesn't have it. Let me find a picture that does here real quick. Oh, here we go. Here is, well, let me find a better one. Maybe this one. Let's see. Yeah, this one's better. This is a little bit more cartoonish drawing of a. They're all cartoons, I guess, but here's another axon or neuron, I should say, right? So here's the dendrites. Here's the cell body. The axon hillock is right here. The axon here is this cable here, and then we have the axon terminal with the synaptic terminals, right? And then that sends the signal onto the next neuron. Now you'll notice on this picture here, which is a little bit more correct, you will see that the axon passes through these little sausages. These are little sausages of fat, right? You can basically think of them as sausages of fat. And they wrap around the axon to insulate it. And they wrap around an axon to insulate it so that it transmits more efficiently. Okay. So instead of that signal having to, inch its way through the entire axon, that signal actually hops. It's called saltatory conduction, saltar to jump. And that signal actually, instead of going just, straight through like that, the signal actually, starts here and then it hops and then it hops and then it hops and then it hops. So it's a lot quicker. It makes the signal go down the axon a lot quicker, which makes sense. I remember when I was a kid many times actually, I was walking around barefooted in my yard as a kid in Uvalde, Texas, and I stepped on a yellow jacket. You ever step on a yellow jacket before? You ever step on one of those before? Hurts like a motherfucker, right? Of course, when you step on a yellow jacket or step on anything that hurts, you ever step on a Lego? Nobody's ever stepped on a Lego before. My God, that's like severe pain right there. Um, what do you do, right? Well, your body sends up the pain signals from your foot up to your through your back to your spinal cord up to your brain, and then your brain says, but in the meantime, your brain's registering the pain, but in the meantime, there's a circuit in your spinal cord that sends a signal back down to the muscles of your leg to lift your foot off the Lego or the yellow jacket. Now you want that to go pretty fast, right? You don't want to be spending 2 or 3 seconds there standing on top of the yellow jacket or the Lego, right? Waiting for your nerves to process the information. You want it to happen quickly. And so the speed by which the nerve cells can conduct is determined, or in mammals anyway, by these, or the speed I should say is enhanced by the little sausages of fat that wrap around the cell. The sausage, the actual product, the actual stuff that the sausages are made of is called myelin, myelin, myelin. Each cell that's wrapped around here, each little sausage is a Schwann cell, Schwann, Schwann cell. And the little gap that's in between the Schwann cells is called the node of Ranvier. Some famous neuroscientist that discovered, some French dude that discovered this back in the early 1900s, right? The node of Ranvier, right? So the signal hops into each node of Ranvier, right? Now, if you have you guys ever heard of the disease multiple sclerosis? You ever heard of that disease before? Multiple sclerosis. Yeah, it's a severe neuromuscular disorder where if you have it real bad, you can't move. You're shaky. You can't move properly, and you can die from it. It's a very serious genetic disorder or autoimmune disease, I think. And what multiple sclerosis is, it's when your body attacks and kills your myelin sheath, attacks and kills all these Schwann cells. That's what your immune system attacks your body and it kills these. So when, as a result, you get rid of all this myelin that you have, and so your cells can't communicate properly anymore. Okay, so that's multiple sclerosis. Now, let's talk a little bit about what happens about the actual signal, right? The actual signal that comes out of the axon terminal. First of all, here's a weird, strange, bizarre fact. Okay, this is very odd. The axon terminal does not actually touch the next neuron or muscle that it's communicating with. Okay, it doesn't actually touch it. So since it doesn't actually touch it, there's a gap in between the axon terminal and the next neuron that it's talking to, or the muscle that it's going to move, right? So since there's this gap, you might be wondering, well, how do they talk to each other, right? Hey, you over there. Hey, I got a signal. Okay, well, thanks a lot. How do they do that, right? How do they communicate across that gap? Well, the gap is called a synaptic gap. A synaptic gap. The point at which those two, the axon terminals from one cell approach the other cell, the dendrites of the other cell, that area right there is called a synapse. A synapse is a fancy word for a connection, right? But that synapse has a gap. It's called a synaptic gap, okay? And the way that the cells talk to each other across that gap is that these axon terminals here, these little bubbles, these little buttons, they're called synaptic boutons, the French word bouton meaning buttons, right? These little buttons are filled with a chemical called a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter. Okay. Let's get a close-up look at the at an axon terminal. Okay, let's see if I can find a nice picture here. All right, let's see. I think this one will work. So here's a close-up view. This is a close-up view. If you guys can see that, let me see if I can. There we go. This is like one of those little buttons, one of those synapses that was at the end of the at the end of the very tail end of the axon, right? So the big signal, by the way, the big signal that comes down the axon is called an action potential. Action potential. That's the name of that big signal that goes down the axon. So this action potential makes its way down to the very end. And you'll notice there's this gap here between the synapse part of the cell that's sending the signal and the other cell that's receiving the signal. There's this gap, and this is the synaptic gap. Now, what happens is that the action potential travels down, and it hits these little bubbles here. These little bubbles are called vesicles. Vesicle, vesicles. When that action potential comes down, these little vesicles move forward, and they connect with the surface of the cell, and they pop. They pop, and they release their contents into the synaptic gap. The contents are chemicals called neurotransmitters. Those chemicals quickly travel across the synaptic gap, and they are designed to fit into molecules on the other side, like a lock and a key. These molecules on the other side are called receptors. Receptors. What happens is these neurotransmitters travel across, they connect to these receptors. That causes the receptor to change its shape. You notice they look kind of like little bell peppers here, like little purple bell peppers. Well, in these particular receptors, what happens is they change their shape and they open up and they allow ions to flow in. And that's the nature of the signal. That's what begins the whole process of the signal developing in this next neuron, is after the neurotransmitter travels, binds to the receptor, causes it to change its shape, and then that produces the change in ions that then causes the signal to grow in that next neuron and then turn into an action potential, and the process continues. Okay. So if we go back, right, if we go back and look at let me see. Let me go to let me show you this, and then we'll call it a night, since it's well, actually, I'll show you this later. So I'll show you this video later. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Since it's I'm showing 6:45 now, so I think it's time to call it a night. I have another class to teach. So does anybody have any questions or comments before we say auf Wiedersehen?
Earlier you mentioned, nuts, I just forgot the part. With the nerves, you said that it would actually only transmit the message if it was deemed important. What happened if it's not important? Do they just like fizzle it out, or
Fizzle it out, exactly. Yeah, they're called potentials, the little tiny messages they're called graded potentials. And yeah, if they don't add up to enough to trigger an action potential, then they just fizzle out. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
All right, guys. Well, Kathleen, get some sleep. I hope you're doing well. Everybody get some rest. I know you guys have had a long day at work, so after I teach my next class, there's a cold beer downstairs waiting for me, so that's what I'm going to have. So there's no caffeine in beer, so that's a good
Hallelujah.
So anyway, you guys have a good day on Wednesday, and I'll see you back here on Thursday night.
See you Thursday, sir. Thank you for your time.
Take it easy.
You too.